Today on our Red House Youth Daily Devotional, we're talking through Acts chapter 7, which is one of the longer chapters. We read that yesterday, and it goes through Stephen's speech and then the stoning of Stephen. So because it's such a long chapter, we're only going to focus on a few points, but there's a lot in this chapter for us to look through and look at. So if you have a chance to read it on your own and maybe get a commentary on Acts, there's a lot of interesting points that Stephen makes in his speech. But he starts his speech by going back to the first patriarch. He talks about Abraham in Mesopotamia, which is way back in Genesis. And he says that the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia. And then from there, he goes through all of these parts of the Old Testament that speak of God providing for his people, beginning with Abraham, going through Joseph when he was sold in Egypt, and then how Joseph was able to provide for his brothers because of the way that God had set Joseph up for success within Egypt. So through God's provision, Joseph provides food for his brothers and Jacob, his father, in their time of drought. And then from there, we see that God provides for the people of Israel to be in Egypt and to prosper. And then he goes in verse 18 and talks about how there was a new king in Egypt, a pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And because of this, it says, dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants. And at this time, Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight, is what it says in verse 20. And when we go through, we're going through it quickly, but Moses was brought up as an Egyptian, which gave him a really unique perspective on the world that he lived in. So he's brought up as an Egyptian, but he knows that he has a Hebrew Jewish culture. And so because of this, he has an affinity for his brethren who are actually enslaved. And so Moses is in this prime position to bring these people out of Egypt and to the promised land. So he goes through and talks about Moses, and that takes several verses because Moses is one of those prophets that they view as extremely important and significant in the life of the Hebrew people. And he goes through, and in verse 42, he says that God turned away from the Jewish people and gave them over to the worship of the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of prophets. And then he quotes Psalm 81, verse 12, where he says, "Did you bring me slain beasts and sacrifices?" And so he talks about how the people of Israel are forced to live in the wilderness. And in verse 45, we're getting to the point where the people are entering the promised land. And it says, our fathers in turn brought it in with Joshua when they dispossessed the nations that God drove out before our fathers. And he's talking about the tent of witness. So he's talking throughout this whole speech about the provision of God, the grace of God, and the fact that God is in the midst of the people in this tent of witness. So the tent of witness is the tabernacle that they're carrying around with them. And then he talks about how David decides that he wants to build a dwelling place for the God of Jacob, which is God. And it was actually, in verse 47, he says it was Solomon that actually built the house. And then he quotes another Psalm 11, talking about how the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands. And that's Psalm 11 again. And we're getting to the end of his speech. And the reason he's walking through all of these different parts of the Old Testament narrative is because these are the parts that have been wrongly interpreted without Christ in the picture. So he's rounding it all off in verses 52 and 53. He says, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one. And this title is in all caps, Righteous One, because it refers to God. It's a proper name. And the righteous one, as a title, actually appears several places. You see it in 1 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Jeremiah, Matthew, and several other places, because the righteous one is the one who is right before God. And then he says something that's really angering for them to hear. He says, the righteous one you have betrayed and murdered. And he says, finally in verse 53, you who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it. And so he's using the narrative of the Old Testament basically to point the finger back at the Hebrews, back at the prophet, or the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who say that they've interpreted the scriptures correctly. And we're running short on time. I would like to spend more time on this. It would make a really good sermon, but not a 5-minute Devo. So Stephen finishes his speech, and it says that the people were enraged in verse 54. And here is the nail that is driven into his coffin in verse 55. It says that Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus sitting at the right hand of God. And what he says is what really pushes the people over the edge. He says, behold, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And that is blasphemy to the Sadducees and Pharisees and all the people of the court that were there. And so when you read the Old Testament, one of the punishments for blaspheming is stoning the person who has said something against God. And the reason they think that this is blasphemy is because, one, they don't believe that Christ is the Messiah like we do. So it's hard for us to understand that something like this, saying the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God, saying that would be blasphemy for us doesn't make sense, but for their culture, for their understanding of the scriptures without the Messiah having arrived, that would be blasphemous because it goes against what they know to be true. It goes against the commandments given in the book of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So we're going to read Acts chapter 8 tomorrow. I would really encourage you to read Acts chapter 7 a few times and work through it section by section, because there's so much in there that can be really informative to your understanding of the Bible. I will see you guys tomorrow.